A police officer pulls over a black veteran, unaware he's confronting a general. The crowd is stunned. Cameras roll. One wrong move and everything changes. What happens next will shock even the most seasoned. But let's start from the beginning. Mike Hollister, a tall and muscular officer with a tense expression, was slowly patrolling the streets on the outskirts of town. The evening was quiet, and deep down he was already prepared for a peaceful shift. But when he spotted a black sedan parked by the curb, he instantly tensed up. The car looked expensive, and he knew this neighborhood inside and out. Seeing such a vehicle in this area was unusual. Without much thought, he turned on his lights and approached the sedan. The driver's door opened, and in the headlights, he saw an older black man who slowly stepped out and waited calmly for the officer to approach. Hollister felt a flash of irritation. He believed the driver should have exited immediately to show he was clean. "Good evening, sir," Hollister said coolly as he stepped closer, his hand not leaving his holster. "I'll need to see your license and registration." The elderly man nodded briefly, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a wallet with his license. Hollister took the document, studying the name. He didn't recognize it, but he noted from the date of birth that the man was well over 60. Rather than put him at ease, this only made Hollister more suspicious. "May I ask what you're doing in this area at this hour?" he asked, his voice laced with distrust as he looked the driver in the eye. The older man looked at him calmly, his expression slightly surprised but composed. "I'm on my way to visit a friend," he replied evenly. "I just stopped briefly to rest." His tone was steady and assured, but Hollister's gaze held suspicion. The man's calm and self-assured manner irritated him. Maybe he's hiding something, Hollister thought, deciding to dig deeper. "And what exactly do you do?" Hollister asked sharply, feeling like he was in control. "I need to know why you're parked here at this hour." Still calm, the man looked at him and answered, "I'm retired, young man. Before that, I served in the military." His words were firm, but Hollister had a hard time believing the man was truly a veteran. The scene was beginning to draw attention. Several passers-by started watching as the officer continued talking to the man, who in no way appeared to be a criminal, though Hollister's tone and manner implied otherwise. Unsatisfied, Hollister pressed harder, his mind already set on the notion that he was dealing with a violator hiding something. Feeling he had the upper hand, Hollister took a step back and commanded in a firm, unyielding tone, "Step away from the car and keep your hands visible." The older man, visibly surprised by the command, looked at him with a hint of confusion, but complied. He carefully exited the car, slowly raising his hands so Hollister could see every movement. His gestures were calm, but his gaze showed the steady confidence of a man accustomed to order. "I only stopped for a moment to rest," he said with restraint but with a dignity in his voice. "Son, is there really a problem with that?" Hollister bristled at being called son. Irritation flashed in his eyes, and he felt the need to assert his authority. "One wrong step, and this guy will understand it's better not to mess with me," he thought. The officer circled the veteran's car, inspecting it as though looking for signs of a violation or some incriminating evidence. He bent down to peer through the driver's window, looked at the back seat and the trunk, not saying a word to the driver. "Why did you choose this spot to pull over?" he asked coldly, casting a stern look at the man. "This isn't a designated parking area. Are you familiar with local laws, sir?" Passers-by watching the exchange started murmuring. An older man walking his dog moved closer, throwing a disapproving look at Hollister, sensing the situation had crossed a line. Around them, phones began to emerge, with some onlookers starting to record the incident. "I don't see a reason for this treatment," the veteran finally said. "I've already shown you my documents, explained why I stopped. I've done nothing wrong." But Hollister was not about to back down. A look of determination glinted in his eyes. "I'll decide if there's been a violation," he said curtly, taking a step forward and gesturing toward the car. "We're conducting a search. Step back and stay put." The veteran's lips tightened, but he silently stepped back, showing no intent to argue. Hollister, feeling a surge of power, abruptly opened the car door and began to search the interior. He bent over, checked under the seats, opened the glove compartment, slamming doors shut with deliberate force as though to make each gesture as loud as possible. At one point, Hollister pulled out a small leather case and opened it. Inside were medals, awards for bravery and years of military service. One medal stood out, a distinction given only to generals. Hollister froze for a moment, realizing that the man before him was a highly decorated military officer, but he quickly suppressed the thought, deciding it didn't matter. "Are these yours?" he asked, holding up the case for all to see. The man nodded, looking at him with a gaze filled with pride and a hint of pain. "These are for my 35 years of service," he said calmly, his eyes steady. "Retired General Williams." The crowd surrounding them went silent. People exchanged glances, realizing they were looking at a distinguished soldier, a man who had served his country, now subjected to baseless humiliation. For a brief moment, Hollister's confidence wavered, but rather than back down, he continued in a harsh tone, struggling to maintain his authority. "Sir, that doesn't matter. You're still parked illegally." Hollister stood facing General Williams, clutching the case of medals as though it were just another object of little importance. There was no respect in his eyes, only arrogance and irritation. Despite his displeasure, the general maintained his composure, standing firm, meeting the officer's gaze without wavering. In the crowd, the onlookers' displeasure grew. One elderly man, a former soldier, couldn't hold back and shouted out, "Hey, do you realize that's a veteran? He's earned those medals." Hollister shot him a cold look, responding only with a disdainful smirk, acting as though he hadn't heard a word. He was irritated that the crowd was getting involved and that the older black man in front of him remained calm, refusing to react to his provocations. "These medals mean nothing here," Hollister said roughly, putting the case back in the car and slamming the door shut. "Right now, you're under my authority, and you'd do well to remember that. I'm the one who decides what matters here." General Williams raised his head slowly, looking directly into Hollister's eyes. His gaze was filled with dignity and inner strength, a reminder of the years of service and trials he had endured. He didn't list his accomplishments. His silence spoke louder than words. "Listen," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "I've traveled the world to protect people like you. I know what it means to follow orders, but I also know that degrading others to prove power is not what we're taught." The passers-by, who had been listening closely, stood frozen. Some continued recording on their phones, and comments grew louder. "This is disgraceful. He's a veteran." "How can they treat someone who risked his life for our country this way?" Hollister felt his control slipping away. He looked at the crowd, realizing the public was siding with the veteran, but he refused to show weakness. He snapped back. "Rules are rules, general or not. A violation is a violation." The general's response was a faint, understanding smile, not smug, but knowing. He seemed to sense that this officer was about to face consequences for his actions. The crowd grew bolder. A young man stepped forward, speaking on behalf of everyone. "You're overstepping, officer. He didn't do anything wrong. He just pulled over to rest. That's not a crime." Hollister began losing his composure. He turned sharply to the young man and hissed, "Step back and stay out of my duties, got it?" But his words only fueled the crowd's anger. Hollister took a deep breath, attempting to retain a facade of cold professionalism. He turned back to General Williams, hoping to conclude the search, but just then a bystander shouted, "We're all recording this. Let the world see how police treat our veterans." Hollister took a step back, sensing that further confrontation could be dangerous for his reputation. Yet something inside still held him back from simply releasing the veteran, as though his sense of authority was preventing him from admitting his error. General Williams, noticing his hesitation, spoke up again, his voice clear for all to hear. "Son, not every day do we get a chance to change course. I'm offering you that moment. Let me go, and this can end peacefully." The crowd awaited Hollister's response, phones capturing every word and movement. The crowd continued pressing on Hollister, who felt the tension mounting. General Williams stood before him, calmly waiting for the officer's decision. Hollister's resistance weakened. He winced slightly, grappling with a growing sense of discomfort. He knew he'd lost control of the situation, but fought to save face. Suddenly, more bystanders joined the crowd, nearly all of them with phones in hand, recording everything. Disapproving glances, whispered demands for justice, and even quiet but clear shouts of outrage bore down on him, making him feel under siege. The authority he felt earlier seemed swept away by the wave of public pressure. General Williams, standing firm and composed, projected the presence of a man experienced in extreme situations. He saw Hollister's inner struggle, but did not push the situation. His gaze conveyed a hidden wisdom and patience, only intensifying the officer's conflict. A woman's voice broke the silence. "We saw him pull over to rest. Why are you treating him like this? He's a veteran." Her words were echoed by others, the murmurs growing louder. "This is unfair," someone in the crowd shouted. "He deserves respect, not humiliation." The world around Hollister felt as though it was closing in. He, who had been so sure of his actions, now found himself questioning them. An unpleasant sensation of fear grew within his chest. He knew many colleagues had gotten into trouble for similar incidents, and now he was at the heart of a scandal. However, stubbornness and a need to assert his authority overpowered his logic, and he managed to respond, struggling to keep his voice firm. "He parked illegally and acted suspiciously. I'm simply doing my job." But this only fueled the crowd's outcry. One man shouted, "Harassing a veteran for resting by the road? That's not duty, that's abuse." Realizing his words were falling on deaf ears, Hollister turned to the general with a final, conflicted look. He understood that if he continued, he would only deepen the trouble that was already spiraling out of control. General Williams, sensing this, took a small step forward, meeting Hollister's gaze, and said quietly but firmly, "Son, everyone deserves a chance to right their wrongs. I'd take that opportunity if I were you." These words broke through Hollister's defenses. He understood that despite all his efforts to appear strong, the situation had turned against him. He nodded reluctantly, stepped back, and muttered, "You're free to go. Consider this a warning." General Williams slowly lowered his hands, nodding back, his face calm, though a hint of gratitude flickered in his eyes. Not triumphant, but thankful. He knew that the officer's concession was not only a sign of respect, but an attempt to salvage some dignity. The crowd broke into applause, and someone shouted, "Finally, justice!" General Williams returned to his car under the approving gazes of the crowd. The applause gradually faded, leaving behind an energy that reminded everyone of what had just taken place. He closed the door and sat behind the wheel, pausing for a moment to look back at the crowd. His eyes reflected gratitude and a quiet sorrow, not for himself, but for those who had yet to find the strength to stand up to such injustice.